The scream that tore through the Rocky Mountain dawn shattered the silence like a gunshot. And Thaddeus Quentin was already moving before his mind caught up with his body, rifle in hand, as he bolted toward his abandoned mine shaft 300 yards from his cabin. He had returned to these mountains of Utah Territory in late September of 1876, after 2 months of trading furs in Salt Lake City, expecting nothing more than the familiar solitude that had been his companion for the past 5 years. What he had not expected was to find evidence of human habitation in the mine he had worked until the silver vein ran dry 3 years ago. Fresh boot prints in the dust, a scatter of pine needles that did not belong, the faint but unmistakable scent of wood smoke where no fire should be. For 3 weeks, Thaddeus had watched and waited, his curiosity warring with his mountain-bred caution. Someone was living in his old mine, and that someone was careful enough to cover their tracks during daylight hours. He had considered confronting the trespasser immediately, but something held him back. Perhaps it was the smallness of those boot prints, or the way whoever it was took pains to disturb nothing, leave nothing, as if trying to be invisible. Now, as another scream echoed off the granite walls, Thaddeus felt his blood turn to ice. That was terror, pure and primal, and he was running full out, his long legs eating up the distance, his shoulder-length dark hair streaming behind him, muscles bunching beneath his buckskin shirt. The mine entrance yawned before him like a mouth, and he plunged into the darkness without hesitation. His eyes adjusted quickly, taking in the scene illuminated by a guttering candle. A woman, small and wild-eyed, pressed against the far wall of the mine's first chamber. Between her and freedom stood a massive black bear, drawn by whatever food she had stored in this space. Thaddeus did not think. He roared, a sound that came from somewhere deep in his chest, and fired his rifle into the ceiling of the mine. The blast was deafening in the enclosed space, and the bear wheeled around, confused and angry. Thaddeus was already working the lever action, chambering another round, placing himself squarely between the animal and the woman. "Get behind me," he commanded, his voice rough from disuse. "Now." The woman did not need to be told twice. She darted past the bear while its attention was fixed on this new threat, and Thaddeus felt her presence at his back, small and trembling. The bear rose on its hind legs, and even Thaddeus, who stood 6 feet 4 inches in his boots and had shoulders broad enough to carry a full-grown deer, felt small before this creature. It had to be 800 pounds of muscle and claw and teeth. But Thaddeus was a mountain man, and he knew these animals. He knew their patterns, their fears, their nature. This was a black bear, not a grizzly, and while dangerous, it could be driven off. He fired again, this time into the ground directly in front of the bear, and the animal dropped to all fours, shaking its massive head. Thaddeus took a step forward, making himself as large as possible, and roared again. The bear huffed, turned, and lumbered out of the mine entrance, disappearing into the forest beyond. Thaddeus stood there for a long moment, every muscle tensed, waiting to see if it would return. When it did not, he slowly lowered his rifle and turned to face the woman who had been living in his mine. She was young, perhaps 23 or 24, with hair the color of honey that hung in a tangled braid over one shoulder. Her dress was worn and patched, the faded blue fabric speaking of hard times and harder travel. But it was her eyes that caught him, large and green as spring grass, filled with equal parts fear and defiance. She was terrified, but she was not broken. "Thank you," she said, and her voice shook only slightly. "I thought I was going to die." Thaddeus studied her for a long moment, taking in the makeshift camp she had created in his mine. A bedroll in one corner, carefully smoothed. a small collection of tin cans and dried goods stacked neatly against the wall, a single change of clothes folded with precise care. Everything about the space spoke of someone trying desperately to maintain dignity in impossible circumstances. "How long?" he asked. She lifted her chin, that defiance flaring stronger. 3 weeks. I am sorry. I know this is trespassing, but I had nowhere else to go, and the mine seemed abandoned, and I thought just until I could figure out what to do next, and he held up one large hand, stopping the flood of words. 3 weeks, he repeated, his voice thoughtful, and you have been careful, quiet. I barely knew you were here. I tried not to disturb anything, she said quickly. I only lit fires when it was very cold, and I made sure the smoke would dissipate before dawn. I never took anything that was not mine, I swear it. The bear, Thaddeus said. What drew it? Her face flushed. I had beans in a can. I was heating them, and I must have been careless with the scraps. I thought I buried them far enough away, but she swallowed hard. I should have been more careful. I am sorry. Thaddeus slung his rifle over his shoulder and studied her more closely in the dim light. She was thin, too thin, her cheekbones standing out sharply beneath her skin. Her hands, when she twisted them together, bore the marks of hard work, calluses, and small scars that spoke of labor and survival. She had been on her own for a while, he realized. This was not a woman who had simply run away on a whim. What is your name? He asked. She hesitated, as if weighing whether to trust him with even that small piece of information. Finally, she said, Willa Zimmerman. Thaddeus Quentin, he replied, and this is my mine, or was before the silver ran out. I will leave, she said immediately, already reaching for her bedroll. Right now. I am sorry for trespassing. I will be gone within the hour. And go where? The question stopped her cold. She stood there, her hands gripping the bedroll, and he saw her throat work as she swallowed. I will figure something out. It is late September, Thaddeus said, keeping his voice neutral. In a month, maybe less, the first snows will come. You have no horse, no wagon, and unless I miss my guess, very little money. Where exactly do you plan to go? Her shoulders stiffened. That is not your concern. You made it my concern when you took up residence in my mine, he said, but there was no anger in his voice. He was curious now, trying to piece together the story of this woman who would rather live in a cold, dark mine shaft than seek help from others. How did you end up here? For a moment he thought she would not answer. Then, perhaps because he had saved her life, or perhaps because she was simply too tired to maintain the walls any longer, she spoke. I was traveling with a wagon train from Missouri, she said quietly. We were heading to California, but there was an accident outside of Salt Lake City. One of the wagons overturned crossing a river, and my aunt, who I was traveling with, was injured. She died 2 days later. I am sorry, Thaddeus said, and meant it. Willa nodded, her eyes distant with memory. The wagon master said I could continue with them, but I would need to pay my own way. I had no money. My aunt had spent everything we had just to get us on that train. They gave me 3 days to find work in Salt Lake City and earn enough to pay, or they would leave without me. And you could not find work in 3 days. I found work, she said, and there was bitterness in her voice now. But not the kind I was willing to do. The men who offered me positions made it clear that my duties would extend well beyond cooking or cleaning. When I refused, they laughed at me. Told me I was too proud for my own good, and I would learn soon enough. Thaddeus felt a muscle jump in his jaw. He knew the type of men she was talking about, the ones who saw a woman alone and thought she was fair game. He had run more than a few of them out of the mountains over the years. So you left Salt Lake City. I started walking, she said simply. I had enough supplies for maybe a week if I was careful. I thought perhaps I could find work in one of the smaller towns, or maybe a farm that needed help with the harvest. But the mountains came sooner than I expected, and I was not prepared for how cold it gets at night. When I found this mine, it seemed like a gift from God. Shelter, protection from the wind. I thought I could stay just until the weather cleared, but then weeks passed, and I still had no plan, no money, nowhere to go. She lifted her eyes to his, and he saw the exhaustion there, the bone-deep weariness of someone who had been fighting just to survive for far too long. "I know I cannot stay here," she said. "I know that, but I just need a few more days to figure out what to do next. Please, just a few more days." Thaddeus looked at this woman who had been living in a cold, dark mine for 3 weeks rather than compromise her dignity, and he made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "No," he said. Her face crumpled, just for a moment, before she pulled the mask of dignity back into place. "I understand. I will leave now." "No," he said again, more firmly. "You will not stay in the mine. You will stay in the cabin." She stared at him as if he had spoken a foreign language. "What? The cabin?" he repeated. "My cabin. It has 4 walls, a good roof, a stone fireplace, and a door that locks. It is weatherproof and bear-proof, and it is infinitely more suitable for human habitation than a mine shaft. You will stay there." "I cannot possibly." "You can, and you will," he said, and there was a note of command in his voice now, the tone of a man accustomed to making decisions and having them followed. "I will not have it on my conscience that I turned a woman out into the wilderness with winter coming on. You will stay in the cabin until spring, and then, if you still wish to leave, I will take you back to Salt Lake City myself." "Where will you stay?" she asked, and he could hear the confusion in her voice, the disbelief that anyone would offer such generosity to a stranger. "There is a line shack about 2 miles north," he said. "It is small, but it will serve. I have stayed there before when the weather turned bad." "A line shack," she shook her head. "No, I cannot displace you from your own home. It is not right." "What is not right is a woman living in a mine when there is a perfectly good cabin sitting empty," Thaddeus said. "Gather your things. I will walk you there now." "Mr. Quentin, Thaddeus," he corrected. "And this is not a negotiation, Miss Zimmerman. You have 2 choices. You can come to the cabin willingly, or I can carry you there over my shoulder. Either way, you are not spending another night in this mine." She stared at him for a long moment, and he saw her weighing her options, trying to determine if he was serious. He was. He could not have explained why it mattered so much to him, why the thought of this woman shivering in the cold darkness made something in his chest tighten, but it did. Perhaps it was simply because he had been alone for so long that he had forgotten what it was like to have someone to protect. Or perhaps it was something else, something he was not yet ready to name. Finally, Willa nodded. "Very well, but only until I can find somewhere else to go, and I will work to pay for my keep. I can cook and clean and mend. I will not be a burden." "Agreed," Thaddeus said, though he had no intention of working her like a servant. "Now gather your things before that bear decides to come back." She moved quickly, efficiently, rolling up her bedroll and packing her meager possessions into a single canvas sack. Thaddeus watched her, noting the practiced ease of her movements. She had done this before, packed up her life and moved on. How many times had she been displaced, he wondered. How many times had she been forced to start over? When she was ready, he led her out of the mine and into the morning sunlight. The air was crisp and clean, carrying the scent of pine and the first hint of autumn's decay. Willa paused at the entrance, turning her face to the sun with an expression of such pure relief that Thaddeus felt something shift in his chest. "This way," he said gruffly, and started toward the cabin. The walk took less than 10 minutes, following a well-worn path through the pines. Thaddeus had built the cabin himself 5 years ago, when he first came to these mountains seeking solitude after the war. It was a solid structure, 20 feet by 20 feet, with walls of thick pine logs chinked with moss and mud. The roof was made of split shakes, sloped to shed snow, and the single window was covered with oiled paper that let in light while keeping out the cold. He pushed open the door and stepped aside, letting Willa enter first. She moved slowly, reverently, taking in the space as if it were a palace instead of a simple mountain cabin. There was a stone fireplace that took up most of one wall, a bed frame in the corner with a rope mattress and thick furs, a rough table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with supplies. It was sparse, but it was clean and dry and warm, and Thaddeus saw tears spring to Willa's eyes as she set her sack down on the floor. "I cannot believe you are doing this," she whispered. "I do not understand why you are being so kind." Thaddeus shifted uncomfortably. He was not accustomed to gratitude, and it made him feel exposed in a way he did not like. "It is just a cabin," he said, "and I have the line shack. It is not a hardship." "It is more than a cabin," she said, turning to face him. "It is safety, it is warmth, it is a chance to survive the winter." "You do not know what this means to me." He cleared his throat, looking away from the intensity in her green eyes. "There is firewood stacked on the north side of the cabin, enough to last you through winter if you are careful with it. The creek is 30 yards east, and the water is clean. I have traps set throughout the area, and I will bring you meat when I check them. There are also supplies in the root cellar: potatoes, carrots, onions, dried beans. Take what you need." "Thaddeus," she said, and the sound of his name on her lips did strange things to his equilibrium. "I do not know how to thank you." "No thanks necessary," he said quickly. "Just keep the fire going and the door barred at night. These mountains are beautiful, but they are not without danger. The bear will likely not return, but if it does, fire a shot into the air. I will hear it and come running." She nodded, her hands twisting together again in that nervous gesture he was beginning to recognize. "Will I see you? Or will you stay away at the line shack?" The question surprised him. "I will need to check the traps," he said slowly. "And there is work to be done before winter sets in. I will be around." "Good," she said, and there was something in her voice that made him look at her sharply. "I would not want to think I had driven you away from your own land." "You have not driven me anywhere," he assured her. "I am choosing to give you the cabin. There is a difference." She smiled then, the first real smile he had seen from her, and it transformed her face. For a moment, the exhaustion and weariness fell away, and he saw the woman she must have been before hardship had worn her down. She was beautiful, he realized with a start. Not in the delicate, porcelain way of the women in Salt Lake City, but in a way that spoke of strength and resilience and fire. He turned away quickly before she could see whatever was showing on his face. "I should go," he said. "Let you get settled. If you need anything, the line shack is due north. Follow the creek until you reach the split pine, then head west. You cannot miss it." "I will remember," she said. "Thaddeus, thank you, truly." He nodded once, not trusting himself to speak, and walked out the door before he could do something foolish like stare at her smile for another moment. The door clicked shut behind him, and he stood there for a long moment, breathing in the mountain air and trying to understand what had just happened. He had lived alone for 5 years. 5 years of solitude and silence, broken only by the occasional trip to Salt Lake City for supplies. He had thought he was content with that life, thought he had left behind the need for human connection when he buried his past and came to these mountains. But now, with one impulsive decision, he had bound himself to this woman, this stranger who had been living in his mind and who looked at him with eyes that saw too much. It was only until spring, he told himself as he started toward the line shack. A few months and then she would leave and his life would return to the way it had been. Simple, solitary, safe. But even as he thought it, some part of him knew he was lying to himself. Willa Zimmerman had walked into his life with nothing but a bedroll and a bag of supplies, and somehow, in the space of an hour, she had changed everything. The lined shack was exactly as Thaddeus remembered it: small, cold, and barely large enough for a man his size to stretch out comfortably. It was 16 feet by 10 feet, with a single bunk, a small potbelly stove, and not much else. He had used it over the years when he was working the trap line on the northern edge of his territory, and it had always been sufficient for a night or two. The thought of spending the entire winter here was considerably less appealing. He dumped his pack on the bunk and set about building a fire in the stove. The work was automatic, his hands moving through the familiar motions while his mind wandered back to the cabin and the woman now occupying it. He tried to analyze what had possessed him to give up his home to a complete stranger, but he could not find a rational explanation. It had been instinct, pure and simple, the same instinct that told him when to take cover before a storm or when to leave a trail because something was not right. Willa Zimmerman was not a threat, but she was definitely something. He just was not sure what yet. Over the next few days, Thaddeus fell into a new routine. He rose before dawn and checked his trap lines, working his way in a wide circle around the territory he had claimed as his own. The autumn hunting was good, and he brought down 2 deer and a dozen rabbits in the first week. Half of each kill he prepared for himself, smoking the meat and storing it in the lined shack. The other half he left at the cabin door, never knocking, never entering, just setting down the wrapped bundles and walking away before Willa could answer. He told himself it was because he did not want to intrude on her space, that he was giving her the privacy she deserved after weeks of living in a mine. But the truth, which he acknowledged only in the darkest hours of the night, was that he was afraid to spend too much time around her. Afraid of what might happen if he did, she left him things in return. Fresh bread wrapped in cloth, still warm from the oven, a pot of stew that smelled like heaven when he lifted the lid. His spare shirt, mended where the shoulder seam had torn. Small gestures that spoke of gratitude and care, and each one made the tight feeling in his chest grow stronger. On the 8th day, he was splitting wood behind the lined shack when he heard footsteps approaching. He turned, axe in hand, to find Willa picking her way through the trees. She was wearing a cloak he did not recognize, and her hair was pulled back in a neat bun. She looked healthier than she had a week ago, he noted. Her cheeks had filled out slightly, and there was color in her face that had not been there before. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, setting down the axe. "Is something wrong?" "No," she said quickly. "Nothing is wrong. I just realized that I have been living in your cabin for over a week and we have barely spoken. I thought perhaps you might like some company for dinner." He stared at her, caught off guard. "Company?" "I made a roast from the venison you left yesterday," she said, "and potatoes and carrots from the root cellar. There is far too much for one person, and it seems a shame to let it go to waste, unless you would prefer to be alone." She said it as a question, giving him an out, but there was something in her eyes that told him the answer mattered to her. She was lonely, he realized. As lonely as he had been before she arrived, maybe more so. At least he had chosen his solitude. Hers had been forced upon her. "I would like that," he heard himself say. "Thank you." Her smile was like sunrise, bright and warming. "Wonderful. Shall we say sunset? That should give you time to finish your work here." "Sunset," he agreed and watched her walk away, his heart doing strange things in his chest. He showed up at the cabin precisely at sunset, freshly washed and wearing his cleanest shirt. He had even trimmed his beard, though he told himself it was simply because it had gotten unruly, not because he wanted to look presentable for Willa. The cabin glowed with firelight, smoke rising cheerfully from the chimney, and he could smell the roast even before he knocked. Willa opened the door, and for a moment they just looked at each other. She had changed into her other dress, the worn fabric carefully brushed clean, and her hair fell loose over her shoulders in waves that caught the firelight. She was, Thaddeus thought with a jolt, absolutely beautiful. "Come in," she said, stepping back. "Everything is ready." The cabin had been transformed in the week she had occupied it. His sparse furnishings were still there, but she had added small touches that made the space feel like a home. Wildflowers in a tin cup on the table, the furs on the bed neatly arranged. A curtain made from an old sheet covering the window for privacy. It was nothing extravagant, but it spoke of care and attention, of someone who took pride in her surroundings no matter how humble. They sat down to dinner, and for the first few minutes they ate in companionable silence. The food was excellent, far better than anything Thaddeus had cooked for himself in years, and he told her so. "My aunt taught me," Willa said. "She said a woman who could not cook was a woman who could not survive, and she was determined that I would never be helpless." "She sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was," Willa said quietly. "She was my father's sister. She took me in when he died, even though she had barely enough to feed herself. I owed her everything." "How did your father die?" Thaddeus asked, then immediately regretted the question. "Forgive me, that is too personal." "No, it is all right," Willa said, though he could see the grief in her eyes. "He was a soldier. He died at Shiloh in '62 when I was 14. My mother had already passed, so I had no one else. If not for Aunt Margaret, I would have ended up in an orphanage or worse." Thaddeus nodded, understanding more than she perhaps knew. "My father died in the war as well," he said quietly, "and my brother. I survived, but it changed everything." "Is that why you came to the mountains?" she asked. "To get away from the memories, in part," he admitted. "I could not go back to the way things were before. Everything felt hollow and meaningless. I needed to find something real, something solid. The mountains gave me that. And have you found what you were looking for?" He considered the question, his eyes on the fire. "I thought I had," he said finally. "I thought solitude was enough, that I could live out here alone and be content with nothing but the trees and the sky for company. But now I am not so sure." He looked at her then and found her watching him with an expression he could not quite read. There was understanding there and compassion, but also something else, something that made his pulse quicken. "I understand," she said softly. "I have spent the last year feeling like I was just surviving, just putting one foot in front of the other because that was all I knew how to do. But this past week, having a safe place to sleep and enough to eat, I have started to remember what it feels like to live instead of just survive. And I have you to thank for that." "You owe me nothing," Thaddeus said roughly. "I did what anyone would have done." "No," Willa said, shaking her head. "Most people would have turned me over to the authorities for trespassing or worse. You gave me your home. That is not something most people would do, and I will not let you diminish it." They looked at each other across the table, and the air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken words. Thaddeus felt the pull of her, the magnetism that had nothing to do with her appearance and everything to do with the strength he saw in her eyes, the resilience that had allowed her to survive when so many others would have given up. He stood abruptly, the scrape of his chair loud in the quiet cabin. "I should go," he said. "It is getting late and I have traps to check in the morning." Willa rose as well, disappointment flickering across her face before she could hide it. "Of course. Thank you for coming. I hope you will come again." "I will," he promised and meant it. The food was excellent, and the company was even better. She smiled at that, a small, pleased smile that made him want to stay, to sit by the fire with her and talk until dawn. But he forced himself to walk to the door, to step out into the cold night air before he could do something he might regret. "Good night, Willa," he said. "Good night, Thaddeus," she replied, and the sound of his name on her lips followed him all the way back to the line shack. October deepened into November, and the mountains began their slow transformation into winter. The aspens lost their golden leaves, standing bare and white against the darkening sky. The nights grew longer and colder, and Thaddeus found himself checking the weather with increasing frequency, watching for the first signs of snow. He also found himself spending more time at the cabin. It started innocently enough. He would stop by to deliver meat or check that Willa had enough firewood. But somehow those brief visits always stretched longer, until he was spending entire afternoons sitting at the table with her, talking about everything and nothing. He learned that she loved to read, but had not owned a book in over a year. The next time he went to Salt Lake City for supplies, he brought back 3 books from the general store and left them on the cabin doorstep without a word. The next day he found a note tucked under a rock by the line shack door. Just 2 words in careful script: "Thank you." He learned that she had wanted to be a teacher before the war, that she had dreamed of opening a school for children whose parents could not afford the expensive academies in the cities. That dream had died with her father, replaced by the harsh reality of survival. But when she talked about it, her face lit up in a way that made Thaddeus want to move mountains to give her that dream back. She learned that he was not the silent, brooding mountain man he pretended to be, that he had a sharp wit and a dry sense of humor that made her laugh until her sides hurt, that he was surprisingly well-read for someone who lived alone in the wilderness, and that he had opinions on everything from politics to poetry. She learned that he was kind, truly kind, in a way that had nothing to do with grand gestures and everything to do with the small things. The way he always split extra wood and stacked it by the cabin door before a storm. The way he brought her the tenderest cuts of meat and kept the tough bits for himself. The way he listened when she talked, really listened, as if her words mattered. And slowly, inevitably, they both learned what it felt like to fall in love. It was not a sudden thing, not a lightning bolt or a moment of revelation. It was gradual, creeping up on them like the winter snow. It was in the way Thaddeus found himself thinking about her at odd moments during the day, wondering what she was doing, if she was warm enough, if she was happy. It was in the way Willa found herself listening for his footsteps, her heart lifting whenever she heard his knock at the door. It was in the comfortable silences that fell between them, the kind that only came when 2 people were completely at ease with each other. Neither of them spoke of it. Thaddeus because he was afraid of pushing her, of making her feel obligated to him because he had helped her. Willa because she could not believe that a man like him, strong and capable and utterly self-sufficient, could want someone like her, a woman with nothing to offer but a grateful heart and a willingness to work. The first snow came in mid-November, a light dusting that turned the world white overnight. Thaddeus was at the cabin when it started, helping Willa repair a weak spot in the chinking between the logs. They had been working in companionable silence when Willa suddenly gasped and pointed. "Look," she breathed. He turned to see fat flakes drifting down from the gray sky, settling on the pines like lace. Willa walked out into the clearing, her face turned up to the sky, her arms outstretched. She spun in a slow circle, laughing with pure joy, and Thaddeus felt something crack open in his chest. "It is beautiful," she called to him. "Have you ever seen anything so beautiful?" He had not, but he was not looking at the snow. He crossed to her in 3 long strides, his boots crunching on the frozen ground. She turned at his approach, her smile fading as she saw the expression on his face. "Thaddeus," she said, uncertain. He did not let himself think. If he thought, he would talk himself out of it, find a dozen reasons why this was a bad idea. Instead, he cupped her face in his large hands, marveling at how small and delicate she felt, and lowered his mouth to hers. The kiss was everything he had imagined and nothing he could have prepared for. She was soft and sweet, tasting of the mint tea she had been drinking, and when her hands came up to grip his shirt, pulling him closer, he felt the last of his reservations crumble away. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Willa stared up at him with wide eyes. "Thaddeus," she whispered. If you are going to tell me that was a mistake, do not," he said roughly, "because I have been wanting to do that for weeks and I will not regret it." "I was not going to say it was a mistake," she said, and there was wonder in her voice. "I was going to say that I have been wanting you to do that for weeks as well." He stared at her, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. "You have?" "Yes," she said simply. "I think I started falling in love with you the day you gave me the cabin. Maybe even before that, when you stood between me and that bear without a moment's hesitation. You are the finest man I have ever known, Thaddeus Quentin, and if you want to kiss me again, I would very much like that." He did. He kissed her until they were both dizzy with it, until the snow had coated their hair and shoulders, and the world had faded to nothing but the two of them. When they finally went inside, stumbling and laughing, he built up the fire while she made coffee, and they sat together on the bearskin rug, his arm around her shoulders, her head resting on his chest. "I do not want you to leave in the spring," he said quietly. "I know that was the agreement, but I am asking you to change it. Stay here, stay with me." She lifted her head to look at him, her green eyes searching his face. "Are you certain? You came to these mountains for solitude. I do not want to take that from you." "You are not taking anything," he said fiercely. "You are giving me something I did not even know I was missing. I love you, Willa. I know it is fast and I know you might need time, but I need you to know that. I love you and I want you to stay." Tears spilled down her cheeks, but she was smiling. "I love you too," she whispered. "I think I have since the moment you roared at that bear, and yes, I will stay. I will stay as long as you want me." "Forever then," he said, and kissed her again. Winter settled over the mountains like a blanket, and Thaddeus moved back into the cabin. They did not discuss it. It simply happened naturally, the way all the best things do. He would arrive for dinner and stay until it was too late and too cold to walk back to the lined shack, and Willa would insist he take the bed while she slept on the floor. This lasted exactly 2 nights before Thaddeus put his foot down. "I am not letting you sleep on the floor in your own home," he said firmly. "We are both adults and we can share a bed without impropriety. I will stay on my side and you stay on yours." It was a reasonable arrangement in theory. In practice, they woke every morning tangled together, her head on his chest and his arms around her, and neither of them complained. They fell into a rhythm that felt as natural as breathing. Thaddeus would rise before dawn and check his trap lines, returning by mid-morning with whatever the wilderness had provided. Willa would have breakfast waiting, and they would eat together, talking about their plans for the day. Then they would work, sometimes together, sometimes separately, preparing for the long winter ahead. Thaddeus taught her to shoot, spending hours in the clearing behind the cabin while she practiced with his spare rifle. She was a quick learner, her aim improving with each session, and the pride in her eyes when she finally hit the target dead center made him want to pull her into his arms and never let go. Willa taught him to dance, humming the tunes her aunt had taught her while they waltzed clumsily around the cabin. He was terrible at it, his large frame and mountain-bred grace no match for the delicate steps she tried to show him, but she laughed so hard she cried. And he decided that making her laugh was worth any amount of embarrassment. They talked about the future, carefully at first, then with increasing boldness. Thaddeus wanted to build a larger cabin, something with separate rooms and a proper kitchen. Willa wanted to start a garden in the spring, to grow vegetables and maybe even flowers. They both wanted children, eventually, though they danced around that topic with the shyness of people who were not yet married but knew they would be. As December arrived, Thaddeus made a trip to Salt Lake City, ostensibly to stock up on supplies before the worst of the winter hit. He returned 3 days later with flour and sugar and coffee, and buried in his saddlebag a simple gold band that had taken every dollar he had saved over the past 5 years. He planned to propose on Christmas, which was still 3 weeks away. He would make it special, he decided. He would prepare a feast, and they would exchange gifts, and when the moment was right, he would ask her to be his wife. The universe, however, had other plans. It was a week before Christmas when the storm hit. Thaddeus had been out checking his northern trap line when the sky turned dark and the wind picked up. He knew immediately that this was going to be bad, the kind of blizzard that could kill a man if he was not careful. He abandoned the trap line and headed for the cabin at a dead run, praying that Willa had not ventured out. The snow was already falling thick and fast by the time he burst through the cabin door, and he found Willa pacing anxiously by the fire. "Thank God," she breathed when she saw him. "I was so worried. The sky just turned black and I did not know where you were." "I am here," he said, pulling her into his arms. "I am fine, but we need to prepare. This is going to be a bad one." They worked together with practiced efficiency, bringing in extra firewood, securing the shutters over the window, making sure they had water and food within easy reach. By the time they finished, the world outside had disappeared behind a wall of white, and the wind was howling like a living thing. They ate dinner by firelight, the cabin warm and snug despite the fury outside. Afterward, they sat together on the bearskin rug, watching the flames dance in the hearth. Willa was quiet, her body tense against his, and Thaddeus knew she was thinking about all the times she had been cold and alone, all the nights she had spent in that mine with nothing but thin blankets to keep out the chill. "You are safe," he murmured into her hair. "I promise you, Willa. You are safe and you are warm and you will never have to face a storm alone again." She turned in his arms, her eyes bright with unshed tears. "How did I get so lucky?" she whispered. "How did I go from sleeping in a mine, certain I was going to die, to this, to you?" "I am the lucky one," he said fiercely. "You walked into my life and turned everything upside down, and I am grateful for every single moment." She kissed him then, soft and sweet, and he felt the rightness of it settle deep in his bones. This was what he had been searching for all those years, what he had not even known he needed. Not solitude but connection, not isolation but love. "Marry me," he said against her lips. She pulled back, her eyes wide. "What?" "Marry me," he repeated, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the ring. It looked small and insignificant in his large hand, but her eyes went even wider when she saw it. "I was going to wait until Christmas, make it romantic, but I do not want to wait. I love you, Willa Zimmerman, and I want you to be my wife. I want to build a life with you here in these mountains, and I want to grow old with you, and I want to fill that big cabin I am going to build with children and laughter and love. Say yes. Please say yes." Tears were streaming down her face now, and her hands were shaking as she reached for the ring. "Yes," she said, her voice breaking. "Yes, Thaddeus. Yes, I will marry you. I will marry you, and I will love you until the day I die." He slipped the ring onto her finger, and it fit perfectly, as if it had been made for her. Then he kissed her, pouring everything he felt into that kiss, all the love and need and devotion that had been building in him since the day he roared at that bear. The storm raged for 3 days, but inside the cabin, Thaddeus and Willa barely noticed. They were lost in each other, in the joy of their new understanding, in the plans they made for their future. They talked about where they would build the new cabin, how many rooms it should have, what they would name their children. They made love for the first time on the second night of the storm, tender and passionate and perfect, and Willa fell asleep in his arms with a smile on her face. When the storm finally cleared, the world was transformed. The snow was waist-deep, sparkling in the sunlight, and every tree and rock was coated in white. Thaddeus dug a path to the woodpile and the root cellar, while Willa stood in the doorway wrapped in furs, watching him work with an expression of such pure contentment that it made his heart ache. "We should get married soon," she said when he came back inside, stamping the snow from his boots. "I do not want to wait." "How soon?" he asked, shrugging out of his coat. "As soon as the pass clears," she said. "We can ride to Salt Lake City and find a preacher. I do not need a big ceremony, Thaddeus. I just need you." He crossed to her and pulled her into his arms. "Then we will do it," he said. "As soon as the weather allows, we will ride to Salt Lake City, and I will make you my wife." But the pass did not clear. The blizzard had dumped so much snow that the trail to Salt Lake City was completely impassable and would likely remain so until spring. They could have waited, but Thaddeus saw the disappointment in Willa's eyes every time she looked at her ring, and he made a decision. "We will marry ourselves," he announced one morning over breakfast. Willa looked up from her coffee. "What do you mean?" "We do not need a preacher," he said. "We can make our vows to each other before God in these mountains. It will be just as binding, just as real. And then, when the pass clears, we can make it official if you want, but I do not want to wait any longer to call you my wife." She was quiet for a long moment, considering. Then she smiled, that brilliant smile that made his heart skip. "All right," she said, "let us do it." "When?" "Tonight," he said. "At sunset." They spent the day preparing. Willa washed her hair and put on her best dress, the one she had saved from her traveling days. Thaddeus shaved and trimmed his hair and polished his boots until they shone. He picked evergreen boughs and wove them into a crown for her hair, and she laughed and cried when she saw it. As the sun began to set, painting the snow-covered mountains in shades of pink and gold, they stood together in the clearing in front of the cabin. There were no witnesses except the trees and the sky, but it did not matter. This was theirs, and it was perfect. Thaddeus took her hands in his, marveling at how small they were, how delicate. "Willa Zimmerman," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "I vow to love you and protect you for all the days of my life. I vow to provide for you, to stand by you in good times and bad, to be your partner and your friend and your love. I vow to build you a home where you will always be safe, and to give you a life where you will always be cherished. This I swear, before God and the wilderness that made me." She was crying, tears streaming down her face, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Thaddeus Quentin," she said, "I vow to love you and honor you for all the days of my life. I vow to stand beside you, to support you in all your endeavors, to be your partner and your friend and your love. I vow to make our house a home filled with warmth and laughter, and to give you a life where you will never be alone again. This I swear before God and the mountains that brought us together." He kissed her then, soft and reverent, and when they broke apart, he whispered, "Hello, wife." She laughed through her tears. "Hello, husband." They went back into the cabin and celebrated their union, and that night, wrapped in each other's arms, they both felt as if they had finally found their way home. Winter slowly loosened its grip on the mountains, and as January turned to February, Thaddeus began work on the new cabin. He chose a spot a quarter-mile from the old one, on a rise that looked out over the valley. The view was spectacular, and Willa spent hours sitting on a fallen log, watching him work and imagining what their life would be like in this new home. He worked like a man possessed, felling trees and stripping logs, digging the foundation deep enough to withstand the worst the mountains could throw at it. Willa helped where she could, but mostly she stayed busy with the daily tasks of survival: cooking, cleaning, mending, keeping the old cabin warm and welcoming for when he stumbled in at night, exhausted but happy. In March, as the snow began to melt and the first green shoots appeared in the meadows, Willa realized she was pregnant. She had suspected it for weeks, but she had not been certain until the morning sickness started. She was terrified and thrilled in equal measure, and she spent an entire day trying to figure out how to tell Thaddeus. In the end, she did not have to say anything. He took one look at her face when he came in for dinner and knew. "You are with child," he said, and it was not a question. She nodded, biting her lip. "Are you happy?" He crossed to her in 2 strides and swept her into his arms, lifting her off her feet and spinning her around until she was dizzy and laughing. "Happy," he said, setting her down but keeping his arms around her. "Willa, I am beyond happy. I do not even have words for what I am feeling right now." "Good words?" she asked, still uncertain. "The best words," he promised. "You are giving me everything I ever wanted but did not know how to ask for: a wife, a child, a family. You are my miracle, Willa Quentin." She rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "We are going to be parents," she whispered. "We are," he agreed, "and we are going to be damn good at it." The new cabin was finished in early May, just as the wildflowers began to bloom across the meadows. It was twice the size of the old one, with 2 bedrooms, a proper kitchen, and a loft that could be used for storage or, eventually, more children. Thaddeus built a rocking chair for the main room, carefully carving the armrests with images of pine trees and mountains, and Willa cried when she saw it. They moved in on a warm spring day, carrying their few possessions from the old cabin to the new one. Willa stood in the middle of the main room, one hand resting on her growing belly, and looked around at the home Thaddeus had built for her. "It is perfect," she said. "You are perfect," he corrected, coming up behind her and wrapping his arms around her waist. "This is just wood and nails. You are what makes it a home." In June, when the pass finally cleared, they made the trip to Salt Lake City. Willa was 6 months pregnant by then, and the journey was not easy, but she insisted on going. They found a preacher at the church on Main Street, and with 2 strangers pulled in from the street as witnesses, they made their vows official in the eyes of the law. Afterward, Thaddeus took her to the finest restaurant in the city, a place with white tablecloths and real china, and they ate a meal that cost more than Thaddeus usually spent in a month. Willa protested at the extravagance, but he silenced her with a kiss. "You are my wife," he said, "and you deserve to be celebrated. Let me do this." They spent one night in a hotel, a real bed with clean sheets and a bath with hot water, and Willa declared it heaven. But the next morning, when Thaddeus asked if she wanted to stay another night, she shook her head. "I want to go home," she said. "Our home, in the mountains." And so they did. Their son was born in late September, almost exactly 1 year after Willa had first arrived in these mountains. The labor was long and difficult, and there were moments when Thaddeus was certain he was going to lose her. But Willa was strong, far stronger than he had ever given her credit for, and when the baby's first cry split the air, he knew that everything was going to be all right. They named him Thomas, after Thaddeus's father, and from the moment he was born, he owned both their hearts completely. He had Willa's green eyes and Thaddeus's dark hair, and a set of lungs that could wake the entire mountain range when he was hungry. Thaddeus took to fatherhood with the same intensity he brought to everything else. He built a cradle for the baby, carving it from pine and lining it with the softest furs. He paced the floor at night when Thomas fussed, singing old war songs in a voice rough from disuse until the baby calmed. He watched Willa nurse their son with an expression of such awe and tenderness that it brought tears to her eyes. "I never thought I could be this happy," he told her one night, as they sat together by the fire, Thomas asleep in his cradle between them. "I thought I had left that possibility behind when I came to these mountains, but you gave it back to me. You gave me everything." "We gave it to each other," Willa corrected softly. "You saved my life, Thaddeus, not just from the bear, but from despair. I was so lost when I came here, so certain that my life was over. And then you gave me your cabin and your heart and a reason to keep going. You gave me a future when I thought I had none." He reached across the cradle and took her hand, threading his fingers through hers. "We saved each other," he said, "and we are going to spend the rest of our lives being grateful for it." The years passed, each one bringing new joys and challenges. They had 2 more children, a daughter named Margaret after Willa's aunt, and another son they called James. The cabin rang with the sounds of laughter and play, and Thaddeus often found himself standing in the doorway, watching his family with a sense of contentment so profound it made his chest ache. He expanded his trap line and eventually started guiding hunting parties into the mountains for wealthy men from Salt Lake City. The money was good, and it allowed him to provide for his growing family with more than just the basics. They added onto the cabin, building more rooms as the children grew, and Willa started her garden, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the rocky mountain soil. The old mine, where they had first met, became a place they visited together on special occasions. Thaddeus would take Willa there on the anniversary of the day he found her, and they would stand at the entrance and remember how far they had come. Sometimes they would bring the children, and Thaddeus would tell them the story of how their mother had been brave enough to survive alone in the wilderness, and how he had been lucky enough to find her. Thomas grew into a strong, quiet boy who loved the mountains as much as his father. He would follow Thaddeus on his trap lines, learning the ways of the wilderness with eager intensity. Margaret was her mother's daughter, practical and warm and fiercely intelligent. She learned to read from the books Thaddeus brought back from Salt Lake City, and she dreamed of being a teacher like Willa had once wanted to be. James was the adventurous one, always climbing trees and chasing rabbits, keeping Willa constantly on her toes. On the 10th anniversary of the day Thaddeus found Willa in the mine, he organized a surprise. He had been planning it for months, working with a builder in Salt Lake City to create something special. When the day came, he blindfolded Willa and led her to a spot in the meadow near their cabin. "Are you ready?" he asked, his hands on her shoulders. "Ready for what?" she asked, laughing. "Thaddeus, what have you done?" He removed the blindfold and she gasped. There, standing proudly in the meadow, was a small schoolhouse. It was simple but sturdy, with real windows and a bell tower, and inside he had placed desks and a chalkboard and shelves for books. "You wanted to be a teacher," he said quietly, "and there are children in the valleys below who need one. I thought maybe you could teach them here in the summers when the pass is clear. If you want to." Willa turned to him, tears streaming down her face. "You built me a school," she whispered. "You remembered my dream and you built me a school." "I would build you 100 schools if it would make you happy," he said, pulling her into his arms. "You gave me everything, Willa. This is just a small way to give something back." She taught for 15 years, every summer bringing in children from the surrounding valleys to learn reading and writing and arithmetic. Some walked for miles to attend her classes, and she welcomed them all with open arms. She never charged a penny, and Thaddeus never complained about the extra supplies they needed, or the fact that their home was constantly filled with children. "You are doing important work," he told her whenever she worried that she was taking too much time away from their family. "And our children are learning the value of education and service by watching you. Never doubt that what you are doing matters." Thomas grew up and married a girl from one of the valley farms, and they built a cabin a mile from Thaddeus and Willa's. He took over his father's trap lines, and Thaddeus slowly transitioned into the role of grandfather, a role he found he loved even more than he had loved being a father. Margaret did become a teacher, moving to Salt Lake City to attend a teaching college before returning to take over her mother's school when Willa finally retired. She never married, declaring that she was too busy changing the world to bother with a husband, and Willa understood completely. James became a scout, leading wagon trains through the mountains and into California. He came home when he could, bringing stories of the wider world, but he always said that nothing compared to these mountains and the family that waited for him here. Thaddeus and Willa grew old together, their hair turning gray, their bodies slowing but their love never dimming. They still sat together by the fire every night, his arm around her shoulders, her head on his chest, talking about their day and their children and their memories. On their 30th anniversary, Thaddeus took Willa back to the mine one more time. They moved slowly now, their joints protesting the walk, but they made it to the entrance and stood together, looking into the darkness that had once been her shelter. "I was so scared," Willa said softly. "I did not know how I was going to survive. I thought maybe I would just stay there until I died, because at least then it would be over. And then you came roaring in like some kind of avenging angel, and everything changed." "You changed everything," Thaddeus said, turning her to face him. "You took a bitter, lonely man who thought he was content with solitude, and you showed him what it meant to truly live. You gave me purpose and joy and a reason to greet each new day with gratitude. I have spent 30 years trying to thank you for that, and I will spend however many years I have left continuing to try." She cupped his weathered face in her hands, looking into the blue eyes that still made her heart skip. "You gave me the cabin instead of turning me away," she said. "And in doing so, you gave me everything. A home, a family, a life beyond my wildest dreams. I love you, Thaddeus Quentin. I loved you when you roared at that bear, and I will love you until I draw my last breath." He kissed her then, slow and sweet, and they stood there in front of the mine that had brought them together. Two people who had found each other against all odds and built something beautiful from nothing. They had 20 more years together, 20 years of watching their grandchildren grow, of sitting on the porch of the cabin Thaddeus had built and watching the sun set over the mountains they both loved. They never left these mountains again, never felt the need to see what else the world had to offer. Everything they needed was right here, in this place that had become their sanctuary. Thaddeus died first, peacefully in his sleep at the age of 78. He had spent the day working in the garden with Willa, laughing as they argued about whether to plant more carrots or more beans. That night, he kissed her goodnight, told her he loved her, and simply did not wake up. Willa mourned him with the whole of her being, but she did not rail against his loss. They had been given more than most people ever dreamed of, and she was grateful for every single moment. She lived for 3 more years, spending her days tending the garden and watching her grandchildren and great-grandchildren play in the meadow where the school still stood. On a warm September afternoon, almost exactly 52 years after the day Thaddeus had found her in the mine, Willa walked to the old cabin they had first shared. It was still standing, weathered but solid, just like their love had been. She sat down on the porch, looking out at the mountains that had witnessed their entire life together, and closed her eyes. Thomas found her there an hour later, a peaceful smile on her face, gone to join the man who had given her the cabin instead of turning her away, who had given her everything instead of nothing, who had loved her with a devotion that had never wavered for over half a century. They buried her next to Thaddeus on the rise where he had built their cabin, under the pines that whispered their eternal song. The whole family came, children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, all of them products of a love story that had begun with a scream in the wilderness and a mountain man who chose kindness over caution. The cabins still stand, both the old one and the one Thaddeus built, maintained by the family who considers them sacred ground. The school still operates every summer, now run by Margaret's daughter, continuing the legacy Willa started all those years ago. The mine has been sealed for safety, but there is a plaque there now, telling the story of the woman who took shelter there, and the man who gave her so much more than just a roof over her head. And on quiet nights, when the wind whispers through the pines and the moon rises over the mountains, some say you can still hear the echo of laughter from the cabin, the sound of a family built on love and sacrifice, and the simple act of one person choosing to see the humanity in another. It is a legacy that continues to this day, passed down through generations, a reminder that sometimes the greatest adventures begin not with a journey, but with a choice to open your heart to a stranger and give them not just what they need, but what they deserve. The story of Thaddeus and Willa became legend in those mountains, told around campfires and dinner tables for generations. It was a story about courage and kindness, about finding love in the most unexpected places, about two people who had both been lost until they found each other. It was a story that proved that sometimes the person who needs saving is not the one living in a mine, but the one who has forgotten what it means to let someone in. And through it all, through the retelling and the years and the changing times, one truth remained constant. Love, real love, the kind that transforms lives and builds legacies, often begins with the simplest of gestures, like giving someone your cabin when they have nowhere else to go, like choosing to see their worth when the world has told them they have none, like opening your heart to the possibility that the person who stumbles into your life might just be the person you have been waiting for all along. Thaddeus and Willa's love story was not just about them. It was about every person who has ever felt lost and alone, who has ever wondered if they would survive the night, who has ever hoped for a miracle. It was a reminder that miracles do happen, that people can surprise you, that kindness is never wasted, and that love, when you find it, is worth fighting for with everything you have. Their great-great-grandchildren still live in those mountains, still tend the land that Thaddeus claimed and Willa made home. They know the story by heart, have heard it countless times, but they never tire of it, because it is not just a story about their ancestors. It is a story about the best of what humanity can be when we choose compassion over convenience, when we choose to help instead of turn away, when we choose to love instead of fear. The mine, the cabin, the school, they all stand as monuments to that choice, to that moment when Thaddeus Quentin looked at a terrified woman who had been living in his abandoned mine for weeks and decided to give her not just shelter, but hope. Not just a cabin, but a future. Not just kindness, but love. And that, in the end, is what makes their story worth telling. Not because it is extraordinary, though it is, but because it is possible. Because it reminds us that we all have the power to change someone's life, to be someone's miracle, to offer grace when the world has offered none. All we have to do is choose it, the way Thaddeus chose it that September morning in 1876, when he gave Willa the cabin instead. That choice echoed through generations, touching countless lives, creating a legacy of love and family that continues to this day. And somewhere in those mountains, under the pines and the stars, the spirits of a mountain man and the woman he loved still walk together, still talk by the fire, still marvel at the life they built from nothing but faith and hope, and a love that refused to be denied. It is a love story for the ages, set against the wild backdrop of the American West, a testament to the power of human connection and the beauty that can grow when two lonely souls find each other in the wilderness. It is the story of how a mountain man discovered a woman living in his old mine for weeks, and instead of turning her away, gave her the cabin, his heart, and a love that would last beyond death itself. And they lived and loved, and left behind a legacy that proves that the greatest treasures are not found in mines or in gold, but in the hearts of those we choose to love and the homes we build together. Thaddeus and Willa found their treasure in each other, and in doing so, they found everything that truly mattered. Their story ended not with sadness, but with fulfillment, with lives well lived and love well given, with generations that carry their names and their values forward into the future. This is their story, complete and whole, a testament to the enduring power of love and the magic that happens when we open our hearts to the possibility that a stranger might become family, that a moment of kindness might become a lifetime of joy, and that sometimes the person living in your mind is actually the person meant to live in your heart. And that, truly and finally, is how the mountain man who gave away his cabin found everything he had ever been searching for, and how a woman with nothing became the richest person in the mountains. They found each other, they built a life, they raised a family, and they loved each other until the very end and beyond. It is, in every sense, a happy ending, hard-won and well-deserved, the kind that reminds us why we tell love stories in the first place.